This story isn't about war. It's about two people who were born on opposite sides of it. Harmony of Storm and Bloom is about what happens when you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. When power isn't used to break the world, but to heal it. So take a breath, let the noise fade, and step into a place where love isn't a weakness. It's the strongest magic there is. The day the contract was signed, the sky wept, not the gentle cleansing rain that nourished the marble terraces of the Luminar Empire, but a bitter, needling downpour that lashed at the stained glass windows of the treaty room. Within, the air was still, thick with the scent of old parchment and older hatreds. Lord Elric of House Blackwood signed with a flourish, his obsidian ring, carved with the sigil of a coiled serpent, striking the wax seal with a sound like a final nail in a coffin. Across the polished mahogany, Lady Melody of House Silverbrook dipped her own quill, the silver hawk on her signet ring seeming to watch him with cold, dead eyes. Outside, the weeping sky gave way to a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the windows in their frames. A lone bluebell, forced into early bloom by the unnatural damp, was torn from its stem and dashed against the glass, leaving a fleeting smear of vivid color. Melody's gaze flickered to the window, her expression unreadable. A bad omen. Elric didn't look up from the document. The omens had been bad for a century, my lady. This merely changes the weather. Your son is to be bound to my daughter, she said, her voice a blade honed by generations of icy composure. Their union is meant to mend a world your ancestors shattered. A little rain seems a trivial complaint. On the word shattered, a tremor ran through the floor. A wine glass on a nearby sideboard vibrated, emitting a low, mournful hum before it cracked. A fine spider web of viscera appearing in its crystal flank. A single drop of red wine welled up and traced a path down its side, like a tear of blood. Elric finally raised his head, his gray eyes meeting hers. My ancestors were pragmatists. You romanticize failure as tragedy, and yours call treachery strategy. Melody set the quill down, the motion precise. Let us hope this arrangement yields better fruit than our histories. The very moment she spoke the word fruit, the air in the room grew warm. A heady, impossible fragrance of summer peaches and sun-warmed earth bloomed in the cold space, originating from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the scent of peace, of harvest, of life. It was so out of place it was an assault. Elric's jaw tightened. He could feel it too, the thrum of something ancient and wild beneath the floorboards. A power that answered not to crowns or contracts, but to the raw, unvarnished truth of what lay between them. Or rather, what would soon lie between their children. They left the room in silence, the treaty forgotten on the table. In the courtyard beyond, as they walked in opposite directions, the weeping rain softened to a mist, and in the heart of a dead rosebush a single perfect white bud began to unfurl. The following dawn painted the sky in apocalyptic shades of bruised purple and feverish orange. A strange wind, warm and smelling of deep earth, and night-blooming jasmines swept through the canyons of the capital city of Blackwood, stirring dust from corners that hadn't seen light in years. In the highest tower of the obsidian spire, Kaelen stood on a balcony carved to resemble a gaping maw, the wind whipping at the hem of his black tunic. He was the spitting image of his father, yet where Lord Elric's features were carved from unyielding granite, Kaelen's held a softer, more volatile geometry. His jaw was less severe, and in the depths of his gray eyes there was not ice, but the churning, chaotic promise of a storm front at sea. Below, the city was a nervous organism. Merchants clutched at hats that threatened to fly away. Children pointed at the sky, their voices thin with excitement. They called it the Soulmaker's Wind, an old wives' tale for the freak weather that sometimes preceded a major union. But this felt different, older. The heavy oak door to his chambers opened without a knock. His father entered, a presence that seemed to absorb the very light from the room. You feel it. The wind, Kaelen said, not turning. And the ground, it shivers. It is the world's acknowledgement of the contract, Lord Elric said, his tone flat. A reminder of the power that once was, and the power that will be again if this union holds. A power your house once commanded. Kaelen finally turned, leaning back against the stone balustrade. A power that burned the world and earned us a century of silence. Forgive me if I don't break out the celebratory wine. Wine is for celebration, Lord Elric countered, stepping closer. This is duty. The daughter of Silverbrook arrives at dusk. Her convoy has already passed the Sunstone Peaks. You will be at the gates to receive her. And if I am not? A flicker of something, not anger but a colder, more final emotion crossed his father's face. Then the shivering ground will be the least of our concerns. The old treaties are frayed, Kaelen. The southern barons speak of rebellion. The Shadowfang clans grow bolder. This marriage is not a negotiation. It is a keystone. Without it, the Blackwood name and everything it has ever built will be dust. He left, the heavy door thudding shut, plunging the room into a deeper gloom. Kaelen stared after him, then back at the manic, vibrant sky. Duty. The word was a stone in his gut. He had heard it all his life. But as he watched a flock of starlings wheel in the sky, their movements so synchronized it was a single living entity, a different feeling stirred beneath the stone. A flicker of what might have been curiosity or dread. He was to be bound to a stranger, a daughter of the house that had been their enemy for longer than the stones of the spire had stood. And the very air, the very earth, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The descent of the sun was a slow, theatrical bleeding of light across the horizon. From the western parapets of the obsidian spire, the world looked dipped in copper and regret. As the city's bells began their sonorous toll, marking the 7th hour, the gates of Blackwood, great monoliths of iron-bound Blackwood, groaning with centuries of resentment, swung open. The procession from Silverbrook was not the triumphal entry Kaelen had anticipated. It was a solemn, almost silent affair. The Luminara banners, usually a dazzling silver and blue, appeared muted in the dying light, their hawk sigils looking tired and ruffled. The guards who rode before the main carriage were not boisterous knights but stern-faced sentinels in silvered plate, their faces hidden behind impassive helms. Kaelen stood at the head of a welcoming party comprised of his father's stiffest-lipped courtiers. The air was unnaturally still, the soul-maker's wind having died as if choked on the city's oppressive architecture. The silence was a physical presence, a weight against the eardrums. He could hear the soft, rhythmic clink of the horse's tack, the creak of leather, the crunch of gravel under the carriage wheels. Each sound was painfully distinct. The carriage drew to a halt before him. It was a thing of silver-white wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl that shimmered like captured moonlight. The door opened not with a servant's hand, but from within. She stepped out onto the gravel, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her name was Aria. He had seen the single formal portrait, a stiff, formal image that did her no justice. The woman before him was not a painting. She was a study in quiet defiance. Her gown was the color of a winter sky just before dawn, a deep, velvety blue that made her skin seem luminous. Her hair, the color of spun moonlight, was braided intricately, interwoven with fine silver chains and tiny, uncut sapphires that caught the last rays of the sun. But it was her face that held him. There was no fear there, no submission. Her eyes, the pale, piercing blue of a glacial lake, met his directly. She held his gaze, her chin lifted in a gesture that was not arrogance, but a simple, unshakable statement of her own presence. The world did not erupt in flowering vines. The sky did not crack open with lightning. There was only the sound of their breathing in the vast, charged silence. The moment stretched, thin and taut. Then, a courtier to Kaelen's right cleared his throat, a wet, obtrusive sound. The spell broke. Lady Aria of House Silverbrook, the man intoned, his voice brittle. "We welcome you to the domain of House Blackwood." Aria's gaze shifted from Kaelen to the courtier, then back again. She gave a single, curt nod. It was not a bow. "Lord Kaelen," she said. Her voice was not cold, as he'd expected, but clear and steady, with a musical quality that was at odds with the tension coiling in the air. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." He almost laughed at the absurdity of the pleasantries. "The journey has yet to begin, my lady." A flicker of something amusement, irony, passed through her eyes. "A truth we both share." As he stepped forward to offer her his arm, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. The air around them grew heavy, thick, and the copper light of the sunset deepened suddenly, flushing to a violent, angry red. A low hum began, not from any human throat, but from the very stones of the courtyard beneath their feet. The guards shifted nervously, their hands tightening on their weapons. Aria's fingers, cool and fine, brushed against the black wool of his sleeve. The moment their skin made contact, the world went silent. The hum vanished. The oppressive light softened back to a benign sunset glow. The tension in the air dispersed as if it had never been. They both froze. Kaelen looked down at their hands. Her fingers, now resting on his arm, were no longer just cool. They were vibrant. He could feel a faint, rhythmic pulse within them, a thrum that resonated with the one he now felt stirring in his own blood. It was like two untuned instruments suddenly finding the same note. He met her eyes again. The glacial calm was gone, replaced by a wide, stark awareness. She had felt it too. This was no treaty. This was a current, live and dangerous. They walked the long path from the gates to the great hall in that shared, electrified silence. Every pair of eyes in the courtyard followed them. The courtiers watched with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination, like villagers observing two mages about to conduct a forbidden ritual. Inside the great hall, a feast had been laid out, a mockery of hospitality. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, glistening with dark juices, dark breads, and wines the color of blood. The air was thick with the smells of cloying spices and damp stone. Tapestries depicting the history of House Blackwood lined the walls. Battles won, lands conquered, enemies broken. One particularly large hanging showed the sacking of Argent, a historical victory for Blackwood and a day of infamy for Silverbrook. In the woven scene, the silver hawk of their house lay in tatters on a field of crimson. Aria's gaze lingered on it for no more than a second before she moved on, her expression unchanged. Yet, Kaelen felt the air around her chill, a palpable drop in temperature that made the flames in the great hearth falter. They were seated at the high table, far apart from the minor nobles who filled the lower benches. Lord Elric sat to Kaelen's right, a statue carved from shadow and disapproval. To Aria's left sat Lady Melody, who had arrived with her daughter's procession and now regarded the hall with the disdain of a queen inspecting a dungeon. The two patriarchs did not look at each other, their silence a wall of frozen hatred. The first course was served a clear consommé shimmering with fat, a spoon scraped against a ceramic bowl. The sound was a shriek in the tense quiet. It was Lord Elric who broke it. He raised his goblet. "To the unification of our great houses," he said, the words tasting of poison. "May this bond heal the wounds of the past." "A noble sentiment," Lady Melody replied, her own glass untouched before her. "Healing, however, requires an honest accounting of the injury." "The past is a ledger, my lady," Elric said smoothly. "And the final balance is always written by the victor." At the word balance, the enormous chandelier hanging above them, forged from iron and the antlers of some great beast, gave a sickening lurch. A chain, slick with grease, groaned. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the entire monstrous contraption would come crashing down onto the high table. A collective gasp went through the hall. Guards surged forward, but the chandelier held, swaying gently, creaking in protest. As it settled, A single drop of hot wax, dislodged by the sudden movement, fell through the air. It spun, a tiny molten star, and landed not on the tablecloth, but on the back of Aria's hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't make a sound, but a single, perfect droplet of blood welled up from beneath the cooling wax, a bead of crimson against her pale skin. Kaelen saw it, and in that instant, a fury, pure and irrational, tore through him. It was not his own. It was hotter, brighter, a silver flame fed by a century of humiliation. He saw the sacking of Argent not as a victory, but as a brutal, squalid affair. He felt the sting of insult as if it were a lash across his own face. His own spoon clattered into his bowl, sending a splash of hot broth across the polished wood. He didn't notice. His entire being was focused on that single drop of blood on her hand. Across the table, Aria's head snapped up, her blue eyes locking with his. Her own fury had been met by an answering storm. She saw in his gray eyes not the cold satisfaction of a conqueror, but a reflection of her own burning outrage. A shared wound, a shared rage. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand crossing the vast expanse of the table. His fingers, trembling slightly, brushed against hers, wiping away the wax and the blood. The contact was a spark in a powder keg. The flames in the hearth roared up, a sudden torrent of fire that blackened the stone above the mantel. Every candle in the hall flared, their light blinding, casting the room into a chaotic dance of writhing shadows. The great hall doors slammed shut with the deafening finality of a crypt being sealed. Panic erupted, chairs scraped. Cries of magic and witchcraft echoed from the lower tables. In the center of the storm, at the high table, there was only silence. Kaelen and Aria were frozen, their fingers still touching. The power wasn't just in the room anymore, it was arcing between them, a living, crackling current. It wasn't just anger, it was the raw, unfiltered truth of their two houses, a legacy of pain and betrayal given form and breath. It was a song of discord, and they were its unwilling singers. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The flames receded. The candles shrank back to their normal size. The oppressive silence was replaced by the frantic, whispered prayers of terrified courtiers. Lord Elric was on his feet, his face a mask of thunder. Lady Melody stood as well, her hand on the hilt of a slender, jeweled dagger she wore at her belt. Their shared alarm was the only thing they had in common. Kaelen pulled his hand back as if burned. Aria did the same, cradling her hand to her chest, her knuckles white. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling beneath the deep blue velvet of her gown. He stared at her, and for the first time he did not see the daughter of his enemy. He saw a mirror, a vessel for the same terrifying power. Lord Elric's gaze swept the room, quelling the unrest with sheer force of will. An old draft, he boomed, his voice rough. The chimneys in this hall are relics, it is nothing. But no one believed him. They had all felt it. The visceral, undeniable surge of power centered on the two figures at the high table. The feast was over. The politicking had just begun. Aria was granted a suite of rooms in the Tower of Echoes, the highest and most isolated spire in the citadel, a gilded cage with a view of the entire sprawling domain of her captors. The rooms were opulent, but they smelled of dust and disuse. The furnishings, all severe Blackwood and silver accents, seemed to be watching her. She dismissed her Silverbrook attendants with a quiet word, needing to be alone. A moment the heavy oak door closed, she felt her composure, her carefully constructed armor, begin to crack. She walked to the window, her reflection a pale, ghostly figure against the backdrop of the moonlit mountains. She placed the hand he had touched against the cold glass. The wax was gone, the bead of blood wiped away, but she could still feel the heat of him, the shocking jolt of connection. His rage hadn't been an assault. It had been an echo. He hadn't just seen her anger, he had felt it. And in feeling it, He had amplified it into a force that had nearly brought the hall down around them. She thought of her mother's face, of the long journey here, of the endless lectures on duty and sacrifice. "You will mend the world," her mother had said. "You will be the bridge." But a bridge is meant to be walked upon, a passive structure of stone and steel. This was something else entirely. This was fire. This was storm. A knock at the door, so soft it was almost a whisper. "My lady, it's Lara, from your household. I brought you a calming tea." Aria let her in. Lara was a handmaiden she had known since childhood, her face a familiar map of worry. She set a tray down on the table, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected the shadows to come to life. "The court is in an uproar," Lara whispered, her hands trembling as she poured the tea. "They are calling it the Soulmaker's wrath. The old tales, they say, when a destined union is forged between houses of great power, the land itself reacts. But the tales also say, they say if the two souls are not in harmony, the reaction is destructive, a harbinger of ruin." Aria took the cup, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. "What of Lord Kaelen? What is being said of him?" Lara wrung her hands. "That he is a vessel of shadow, that the Blackwood line has always been tainted by the earth magic, a volatile, uncontrolled force. They fear him, my lady. They fear what you have awakened." Aria thought of the fury in his gray eyes, not the coldness of a tyrant, but the wild energy of a caged beast. She looked down into her tea, the steam blurring her reflection. "They should fear what we have awakened together." The next morning, Kaelen sought the one place in the entire citadel where the stone didn't feel like it was pressing in on him: the library. It was a circular room high in the spire, its walls lined not with books, but with scrolls and tablets dating back to the founding of their houses. The air smelled of old vellum, dried herbs, and secrets. He needed answers. The power he had touched, the feeling of his own soul being laid bare, it went beyond the folk tales of the Soulmaker. This was a language he didn't speak, a history he had never been taught. He found what he was looking for in the dusty chest bound with iron, not a history of war or politics, but a treatise on the old magic. The author was a long-dead Blackwood scholar, a man branded a heretic for suggesting their power was not one to be wielded, but one to be understood. The script was archaic, the ink faded. The text spoke of the world as being born of two opposing forces, the tear and the thorn. The tear was the magic of Luminara, the Silverbrook line emotion as water, flowing, healing, intuitive, a power that nourished. The thorn was the magic of Blackwood emotion as earth and storm, solid, shaping, volatile, a power that built and broke. And it spoke of the convergence, a rare alignment when a soul of the tear and a soul of the thorn were bound. The union didn't just create harmony, it created a new state of being. It was a force of creation or destruction depending on the balance. One did not simply command it, one had to listen. A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt. Aria stood in the doorway, the morning light haloing her silver hair. She hadn't announced herself. She looked less like a prisoner and more like a wraith, her face pale but her blue eyes clear and focused. "I did not expect to find you in a place of knowledge," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the silent library. "I was told your family preferred their histories carved in bone, not written in ink. And I was told your family found truth more palatable when couched in allegory and poetry," he retorted, closing the book with a soft thud. The defensiveness was automatic, a reflex honed by years of training. He felt a familiar prickle of static on the air, a warning. The room's temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. She ignored the jab, her gaze falling on the book in his hand. "Convergence," she read the faded title on the spine. "I have a similar text in my own archives." We call it the tiding of the twin waters. It speaks of two rivers flowing together to create a sea. It is much softer. Your poets always were more concerned with beauty than with function, he said, though the words felt hollow, even to him. He remembered the raw, untamed feel of her fury, the absolute lack of softness in it. And your generals are more concerned with victory than with cost, she countered, taking a step into the room. We both read the same story, Lord Kaelen. We just focus on different chapters. As she spoke, her gaze drifted to one of the high, arched windows. Outside, a single stubborn cloud scudded across an otherwise perfect blue sky. You feel it too, she said, a statement, not a question. The hum beneath the floorboards, the way the light changes when we are near. He couldn't deny it. It is not a hum. It is a growl, a warning. A warning of what? That this bond is a leash, he said, his voice low. And we are being dragged toward a fate neither of us chose. Or, she said, taking another step closer, her boots making no sound on the ancient floorboards. It is a current, and we are learning not to drown in it. She stopped before a large, faded tapestry that depicted a scene not of war, but of planting. A man and a woman stood in a barren field. The man held a stone, the woman a vial of water. Where their shadow met on the ground, a single, vibrant tree was growing. The first convergence, Aria said softly, her fingers almost, but not quite, touching the coarse fabric. Not a king and a queen. A stonemason and a weaver. They ended a plague that was withering the continent. Not with swords, but with a song. One of earth, one of water. A myth your people tell children to make them less afraid of the dark, Kaelen scoffed. But he found himself staring at the tapestry, at the point where the two shadows merge. A myth we stopped telling a century ago, she corrected, her voice laced with a cold sorrow. After your stonemason's descendants crushed my weavers under a wall of rock. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and crystalline. The growl he felt in the floorboards intensified, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window began to swirl, forming a miniature, agitated vortex. He looked from the tapestry to her face. Her blue eyes were not accusatory, but weary, burdened. He saw in them the same crushing weight of history he felt in his own soul. For the first time, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a fellow prisoner in a shared, inherited cage. He took a breath, forcing the anger down, wrestling it into submission like a wild dog he'd been tasked to train. The rumbling in the floor subsided. The dust settled. "Why are you here, Aria?" he asked, and the use of her name, unbidden and unadorned, surprised them both. She seemed to consider the question, her gaze drifting back to the tapestry. "Because in the hall last night, when the fire roared, for a moment I was not in Blackwood. I was on the Sunstone Peaks, watching our banners burn. I was feeling a grief that was not mine alone. It was yours. It was everyone's. It was the grief of the land itself. And I think," she paused, turning her full, terrifyingly clear gaze on him, "I think you were there with me." The confession was a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He remembered the sudden, vivid flash of the sacking of Argent, not as a glorious battle, but as a brutal, squalid tragedy. He had felt her humiliation as a physical blow. "My father says this union is a keystone," he said slowly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "He sees it as a tool of statecraft. And my mother sees it as a sacrifice," Aria replied. "A price to be paid for peace. They both see a contract, a transaction. But we are living inside the ink." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy with hatred, but humming with a new, fragile understanding. The space between them felt charged, but no longer dangerously so. It felt potential, like the quiet pressure in the air before a life-giving rain. "The treatise I was reading," Kaelen said, gesturing to the book on the table. It doesn't speak of control, it speaks of resonance, like two tuning forks. Strike one, and the other will sing. To fight it, he trailed off, is to create a dissonance that shatters glass. She finished for him, and sets tapestries ablaze. They stood there, two heirs to a legacy of failure, standing on the precipice of a terrifying new truth. Their ancestors had spent 1,000 years trying to conquer each other, and in doing so had never stopped to listen to the world they were fighting over. They had been using their magic like a cudgel. Maybe it was meant to be a language. "We are being watched," Aria said, her voice dropping to a whisper, her eyes flicking to the dark corners of the library. "Not just by the courtiers. The very walls have ears." "Then let us give them something to hear," Kaelen said, a reckless idea taking root. He walked to the library door and opened it, speaking loudly to the guards stationed outside. "The Lady Aria will be dining with me in my private solar this evening. See that we are not disturbed." He shut the door before they could reply, Aria's eyebrows raised in a perfect, questioning arch. "An alliance of convenience is whispered about in corridors and signed in ink," Kaelen said, turning back to her, a determined light in his gray eyes. "The one of trust, that must be declared. Let them see us talk. Let them wonder." The news spread through the citadel like a lit fuse. The Blackwood wolf and the Silverbrook hawk dining alone. The speculation was a fever. Some saw it as a master stroke by Lord Elric, a display of dominance. Others, in hushed tones, saw it as the first step of a dance that could end in either salvation or damnation. Kaelen's solar was a smaller, more personal chamber than the great hall. A single round table stood before a leaded glass window that overlooked the churning gray expanse of the Serpent's Tear River. There was no throne, only 2 chairs. No retinue of servants, only one silent, stoic page who brought in their meal and then departed, closing the door with a soft click. The food was simple. Roasted river fish, sharp white cheese, dark bread, and a carafe of pale, gold-colored wine. It was an absence of pageantry that felt more significant than any feast. They ate in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the scrape of silverware and the distant cry of a gull. The air was thick with unspoken things. "When I was a child," Aria began, her voice quiet, breaking the stillness, "my mother would take me to the weeping gardens in our capital. There is a fountain there, carved from a single piece of marble. They say it was carved by the first convergence, the stonemason. When the moon is full, the water does not reflect the sky, but the stars of the southern hemisphere, the ones you cannot see. A trick of the light," Kaelen said, the cynical response automatic. "Perhaps," Aria conceded. "Or perhaps the stone remembers the water it was shaped with. Perhaps it is trying to show us a different part of the sky." She took a sip of wine, her gaze unwavering. "My mother told me that the fountain reminds us that there is always more to see than what is right in front of us. That the world is wider than our own reflection." As she spoke the word reflection, the surface of the wine in her glass shimmered. For an instant, the room's reflection was not of the stone walls, but of a star-dusted sky, impossibly deep and vast. The illusion lasted only a heartbeat, a fleeting glimpse of another reality. Kaelen stared, his own wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. He had felt the surge of magic, a gentle pulling tide, not a violent storm. It was her, not her anger, but her memory, her longing. "It is a story," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, like the one in the library, comforting myths. "Myths are simply truths that have lost their context," she replied, setting her glass down. The strange light in the wine vanished. "You felt it in the hall. The anger, the grief. Was that a myth?" He looked away, out at the dark, roiling river. "I felt a loss of control. I have been trained since birth to command, to dominate. This connection, it does not obey. It responds. It makes me feel." "And feeling is weakness in the house of Blackwood?" she asked, though her tone held no accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. It is a vulnerability, he corrected. A crack in the armor, and in our lands, a crack is an invitation to a blade. And yet, without vulnerability, she countered softly, there is no bridge, only walls. The word walls landed like a stone. A sudden chill seeped into the room, a damp, earthy cold that smelled of a crypt. The light from the single oil lamp on the table flickered, casting long, grasping shadows that clawed at the corners of the room. He felt it again, the old, familiar pull of the Blackwood magic, reactive and defensive. He hadn't even been aware of the emotion that triggered it. A sudden, sharp memory of a tutor's lesson. Never let them see your soul, boy. It is the only thing they cannot steal. Aria shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She saw the shadows, felt the cold. She did not flinch from it. You are doing it again, she said, her calm a stark contrast to the room's sudden unease. You are building a wall. I am protecting myself, he snapped, the defensiveness flaring hot. The chill in the room intensified. No, she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength that cut through his anger. You are protecting the idea of yourself that your father gave you? The stone, not the earth, the thorn, not the root. She leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. But the root is what nourishes the thorn. You cannot have one without the other. Your magic is not a weapon to be wielded, Lord Kaelen. It is a foundation. Let me show you. He started to scoff, to push back with another barb, but something in her gaze stopped him. There was no pity there, only a strange, unwavering certainty. Hesitantly, she reached her hand across the table, palm up. An invitation. He stared at her hand. It was a small, pale thing in the lamplight, but it held the weight of empires. To touch it again, deliberately this time, was an act of surrender. A capitulation to everything he had been taught to despise. Slowly, with the feeling of stepping off a cliff into unknown depths, he placed his hand in hers. The contact was not a shock, it was a resonance. The deep, humming growl of the Blackwood magic did not vanish, but it changed its key. The chill in the air warmed, the grasping shadows receded, melting back into the stone. Close your eyes, she whispered. He did. Instantly, the world dissolved. He was not in a stone room in a dark citadel. He was standing in the weeping garden she had described. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. Before him stood the marble fountain. The moon, full and impossibly bright, shone down upon it. The water in the basin did not reflect the moon's light, but churned with a million distant pinprick stars. He felt Aria's presence beside him, not as a person, but as a current of feeling. A deep, quiet nostalgia. A sense of peace that was not emptiness but fullness. This was her memory, her truth, and she was sharing it. He could feel the strength in it, not the rigid, unyielding strength of a fortress wall, but the resilient, enduring strength of a river that carves stone over centuries. Then, the memory shifted. As if in response to his presence, the marble fountain began to change. It was no longer just smooth flowing water. Veins of rich, dark granite began to thread through the white marble. The basin's edge developed a rugged, powerful definition. The water flowing over it seemed to deepen, its flow becoming more certain, carving its own path against the stone. The memory of the weaver was being met with the memory of the stonemason. The water was shaping the rock. The rock was giving the water its course. The image in the basin shifted again. The stars vanished, replaced by a swirling, tumultuous vision. He saw the great hall, not as it was, but as a memory etched into the land itself. He saw centuries of feasts and treaties, each one a lie, each one another stone added to the wall between their houses. He saw the sacking of Argent, not as a glorious victory, but as a brutal act of breaking. He felt the land's recoil, the deep psychic wound left by a people turning a tool of creation into a weapon of destruction. But then a new vision bloomed in the water. He saw the two of them, not as they were, but as they could be. standing not in a fortress or a palace, but in a field of dry, cracked earth. He held a stone, she held water. And as they looked at each other, a single green shoot pushed its way up through the dirt between them. He opened his eyes, gasping, pulling his hand back as if he had been scorched. He was back in the solar. The room was warm, the lamplight steady. The vision was gone, but its echo remained thrumming in his bones. He looked at Aria. She was breathing heavily, her face pale, her blue eyes wide and dazed. She had seen it too. A foundation, he breathed, the word feeling new and strange in his mouth. Not a weapon. She nodded slowly, a single, graceful motion. The land remembers the shape it is supposed to be. Our houses, we are its sickness, a fever, but the fever can break. In the silence that followed, a new sound filled the room. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first they thought it was the rain, but the sky outside the window was clear. The tapping was coming from inside the room. They turned as one. On the stone floor near the foot of the table, a single green shoot was pushing its way up through a crack in the flagstones. It was an impossible, defiant thing. As they watched, it grew, two small leaves unfurling, reaching for the lamplight. It was a physical manifestation of their shared vision, a bridge, not of words, but of life itself. Days turned into a week, and a fragile, tentative truce settled over the obsidian spire. Aria and Kaelen began to spend more time together, their meetings no longer fraught with the tension of a political maneuver, but with the quiet intensity of an experiment. They walked the battlements at dawn, their conversations circling the central terrifying truth of their bond, always at a distance, like two people testing the ice on a frozen lake. They found that strong, uncontrolled emotion was a catalyst for chaos. A flash of irritation from him would cause the torches in the hallway to smoke and gutter. A wave of sadness from her would make the corridors inexplicably damp, the stones weeping a thin, salty moisture. But they also found something else. A quiet, shared wonder was a different kind of magic. One evening, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, Aria laughed at a wry comment he made about a particular courtier's ridiculous feathered hat. The sound, clear and genuine, caused a cascade of moonlight-colored, night-blooming cereus flowers to suddenly erupt from the stone planters lining the balcony, their ephemeral, fragrant blossoms opening to the stars. Kaelen stared at them, then at her, a slow smile touching his own lips for the first time she had ever seen. It was not a smile of mockery, but of genuine, unguarded surprise. The sight of it did something strange to her heart. In response, a single, perfect snowflake, impossibly intricate and delicate, drifted down from the cloudless sky and melted on the back of his hand. They were learning the language. Laughter was a word for creation, shared wonder, a phrase for beauty. Their connection was not a leash. It was a conversation, and the world was their conversation partner. Yet, the old animosity was a beast that did not die easily. In the great hall, at a tense midday meal, Lord Elric made a cutting remark about the softness of the Luminara trade routes, a not-so-subtle jab at their perceived lack of martial strength. A wave of indignation, cold and sharp, washed over Aria. Instantly, the platters of food on the long tables grew slick with a thin layer of frost, the meat and bread taking on a pallid, frozen look. The courtiers shivered, pulling their cloaks tighter. Kaelen, seated beside her, felt the sudden drop in temperature. He didn't look at her, but at the untouched goblet of wine before him. He focused not on anger, but on a memory he had shared with her, the feeling of a warm, stable hearth in the depths of winter, a sense of stolid, unyielding warmth. Slowly, the frost receded. The air warmed. The magic was a tug of war, and they were only just learning to pull in the same direction. But their tentative harmony did not go unnoticed. There were whispers in the shadows. Lord Elric watched them with a hawk's predatory gaze, his pride warring with a burgeoning suspicion. Lady Melody, for her part, observed her daughter with an unreadable expression, her fingers often tracing the hilt of her jeweled dagger as if in prayer. The most dangerous observer, however, was one they never saw. In the lower levels of the citadel, in a chamber that smelled of embalming fluids and old secrets, a man in the gray robes of a lore master pored over a stack of ancient scrolls. His name was Varric, and he had been an advisor to House Blackwood for longer than anyone cared to remember. His face was a pale, bloodless mask, his eyes small and dark like chips of flint. He had felt the surges of power from the high tower, not the chaotic, uncontrolled burst of two houses at war, but something new. Resonance, harmony. It was a contagion that, if left unchecked, could unravel a century of carefully laid plans. He picked up a quill, the nib stained a deep, sinister red. He dipped it in an inkwell filled not with black, but with a viscous, shimmering liquid. He began to write, not on parchment, but on a thin, translucent sheet of cured human skin. The text was in no known language, a script of hooks and thorns that seemed to writhe on the page. The plan was not to stop the Union. The plan was to pervert it. A week later, an invitation arrived for Aria, delivered not by a Blackwood page, but by her own mother's seneschal. It was an invitation to walk the sunken gardens with Lady Melody. Aria knew it was not a request, but a summons. The sunken gardens were a marvel of luminar engineering, a lush, humid paradise carved into the rock deep within the citadel, a remnant of a long-forgotten alliance. The air here was thick with the scent of wet earth and exotic blossoms, the walls draped in moss and glowing fungi. Her mother was waiting for her by a reflecting pool, her silver-clad figure a stark, elegant slash against the riot of green. She did not turn as Aria approached. "You spend a great deal of time with the Blackwood heir," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "We are learning to coexist," Aria offered carefully. "You are learning to share your soul with a viper," Melody corrected, finally turning. Her pale blue eyes were chips of ice, and the viper is learning the taste of your spirit. "I see it in you, Aria, a softening. A dangerous sympathy." "It is not sympathy, Mother, it is understanding," Aria said, a flicker of her own defiance rising. "Their magic is not evil, it is wild, untaught. His rage is a reflection of our own." "Of reflection?" Melody laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Child, you are looking in a funhouse mirror. He shows you what he wishes you to see. While you are admiring your shared understanding, his father is rallying the Shadowfen clans. While you are learning to make flowers bloom, Varric, the lore master, is consulting scrolls on blood rights." Aria felt a cold dread wash over her. "What do you mean?" "The Blackwoods have a different interpretation of the convergence," Melody said, her gaze sharp as a shard of glass. "They believe it is not about balance, but about dominance. The tear does not temper the thorn, it feeds it. The tear gives the thorn its power. Your magic, Aria, is not meant to be a partner to his, it is meant to be a fuel." The word struck Aria with the force of a physical blow. She thought of the vision in the fountain, of the rock and the water. Had she misinterpreted it? Had he? The memory of the shared power, the feeling of rightness in the solar, suddenly felt fragile, naive. As her mother's words sank in, a profound sadness welled up within her, a cold and heavy thing. The humidity in the garden intensified, the air growing thick and suffocating. The glowing fungi on the walls dimmed, and a fine, slick moss began to creep rapidly across the stone flags of the path, black and slick with decay. The water in the reflecting pool clouded over, churning with a gray, lifeless sludge. "He is playing you, Aria," Melody pressed, stepping closer. "Every shared glance, every moment of harmony is a calculated move to lower your defenses. The final piece of their conquest will not be an army at our gates, but your own power turned against your people. They will break us not with a stone, but with our own tears." The garden was now a place of rot. the beautiful flowers hanging their heads, their petals turning to black mush. The air was foul. Aria felt her control slipping, the deep earthy power of Blackwood's vision of her, the weeping, sorrowful tear, the source of decay manifesting with terrifying speed. She was making her mother's prophecy real, act. The same day, as dusk settled over the spires, Kaelen was summoned to his father's private war room. The chamber was stark and functional, its walls dominated by a massive, detailed map of the two kingdoms, carved into the surface of a single, polished obsidian slab. Tiny, intricately carved markers of silver and onyx denoted troop movements. Varric, the lore master, was there, a silent presence in the shadows, his pale face seeming to float in the gloom. The air smelled of old maps and something else, something acrid and metallic. "The reports from the Shadowfen are promising," Lord Elric said, not bothering with greetings. He tapped a cluster of onyx markers near the southern border. "The clans are restless, they remember old loyalties and old hatreds. The Silverbrook patrols have been light," Kaelen noted, his voice neutral. He had learned to play these games, to offer observations that were neither for nor against, but simply facts. "They are complacent," Elric sneered, "softened by generations of peace and poetry. They believe this marriage is their shield. They do not yet understand it is the key that will unlock their gates for us." Kaelen felt a prickle of unease, the memory of Aria's hand in his, the vision of the green shoot, a stark contradiction to his father's words. The convergence, the text suggest balance is required, that without it the power itself turns to ruin. The texts were written by the losers. Varric's voice slithered from the corner. It was a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. The first convergence was a failure, a brief sentimental interlude before the true nature of power was understood. The tear is not an equal, it is a catalyst. The Silverbrook line does not command the world's emotions, it is merely the vessel through which they flow. The Blackwood line shapes those emotions into reality, into strength. We are the hand, they are the clay. A cold knot formed in Kaelen's stomach. He thought of the night-blooming flowers, of the snowflake in the clear sky. Those had not been acts of shaping, of domination. They had been responses, shared moments, a conversation. "My lord's son is hesitant," Varric observed, his dark eyes fixing on Kaelen. "He feels a pull toward the old fables, toward harmony. Hesitation is a luxury we can no longer afford," Lord Elric said, turning his full, formidable gaze on his son. "This union will proceed, and it will secure our supremacy. The girl will be brought to heel, or she will be broken. Her power will be the tool for our ascendance. See that you do not mistake her fleeting moments of compliance for submission. They are but the lull before the storm she cannot control and which you will learn to command." As his father spoke the word command, the map on the wall seemed to shift. The onyx markers of the Blackwood troops did not move, but they seemed to deepen, their blackness becoming absolute, pulling in the light from the room. The air grew thin, cold, and heavy, the same suffocating pressure he had felt in the solar before he had taken her hand. It was the magic of the thorn, but not the wild, chaotic energy he shared with Aria. This was a focused, calculated pressure, a threat. "I understand my duty," Kaelen said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He turned and left the room, the heavy door sealing him in with the scent of iron and ambition. He walked the stone corridors, a familiar dread coiling in his gut. His father and the lore master weren't planning a marriage. They were planning a conquest, and Aria was the battlefield. He found himself striding not toward his own rooms but toward the Tower of Echoes. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew he had to see her, to see for himself if the poison he had just been fed was true. He found her not in her rooms but on a high, windswept balcony that overlooked the sea of jagged peaks surrounding the citadel. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and purple. She was alone, her arms wrapped around herself, a solitary, vulnerable figure against the vast, hostile landscape. The moment he saw her, he felt it, a deep, desolate grief emanating from her in waves, so potent it was almost a physical presence. The wind, which had been a steady gale, died, becoming a damp, mournful sigh that smelled of salt and decay. The vibrant sunset seemed to bleed out, the colors muting to a sickly gray. "Aria," he said, his voice soft. She turned, and the sight of her face struck him like a physical blow. All the composure, the quiet strength, was gone. Her eyes were wide with a pain so profound it seemed to hollow her out. In their depths, he saw not anger, but betrayal. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. He knew immediately what she meant. The poison had reached her, too, from its own source. "What my father told you? About the Shadowfen? About Varric?" Her gaze sharpened. "He told you that. And did he tell you the rest? That my power is to be your fuel? That this connection we feel is a lie? A tool for you to use to break my people?" The accusation was a knife to the heart. He thought of the shared vision, the green shoot. The idea of it being a lie was a violation so profound it made him dizzy. The air around them grew colder still, and a fine, rime frost began to creep across the stone balustrade. "Is that what your mother told you?" he countered, his own voice rising with a mixture of hurt and defensiveness. "That I am a monster? That every moment of shared wonder was a calculated act of deceit?" The frost thickened, spreading across the floor, branching out from them like a crack in glass. The grief between them curdled, becoming a vortex of mutual suspicion and despair. The land was responding, not to their separate emotions, but to the dissonance between them. "I don't know what to believe," she cried, her composure shattering completely. "I feel what we share, Kaelen. I felt it in the library, in the solar. But then my mother shows me a history, a truth, and you tell me your father has the same plan. A plan to use me, to break me." She looked at her hands as if they were alien things. "This power, it feels like a curse." As she spoke the word curse, a deep tremor shook the balcony. The stone beneath their feet groaned, a long, agonized sound of rock under immense pressure. Far below, in the courtyards of the citadel, shouts of alarm began to rise. They were destroying it. The harmony they had so carefully cultivated was fracturing, and the world was breaking along with it. "She is wrong," Kaelen said, stepping toward her, his mind racing. He pushed past the sting of betrayal, focusing on the core of what he knew to be true. "My father wants it to be true. Varric whispers it in his ear because it is the path of power they understand, the path of breaking. But that is not what I have felt with you." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "What was the vision in the fountain? A trick?" "It was a memory of what could be," he said, closing the distance between them. He ignored the creeping frost, the trembling stone. He reached out and took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. The stone and the water, the thorn and the root, not one dominating the other, one giving the other its purpose. Your mother sees the tear as weakness. My father sees the thorn as a weapon. They're both wrong. As he spoke, a new energy began to flow from him. Not the aggressive, demanding pressure of the thorn, but the deep, steady resonance of the earth, the core, the foundation, a warmth, a solidity. He was not trying to command her, he was trying to ground her. To ground them both. Aria stared into his gray eyes, searching for deception but finding only a desperate, fervent sincerity. She felt the warmth from his hands seeping into her cold skin. She felt the deep, humming stability of his magic. Not a wall, but a bedrock. She made a choice. She chose to believe not their parents, not the histories, but the shared language she had discovered with him. She let her own magic rise, not in a wave of sorrow, but as a tentative, trusting current flowing toward his. The moment their magics touched again, this time in deliberate conscious alliance, the world stilled. The tremor ceased. The frost on the balustrade did not melt. It bloomed. The brittle white ice transformed into a carpet of tiny pale blue flowers, delicate as frost but filled with impossible life. The air warmed, the mournful wind becoming a gentle, fragrant breeze that carried the scent of those flowers. They were creating again. Together. They want a war, Aria whispered, her hands coming up to cover his. They want to use us as the generals. Then we must refuse to fight, Kaelen said, his thumb stroking her cheek. We must change the rules of the game. Their truce was no longer an experiment, it was a pact, a secret alliance forged in the crucible of their parents' betrayal. They knew they were being watched, their every interaction scrutinized for signs of dominance or submission. So they played the part. In public, they were cool, formal. They walked together in the gardens, their conversation limited to bland pleasantries about the weather or the architecture. They dined in silence, the space between them a carefully curated void. They were two noble hostages fulfilling their duty, and their performance was convincing. The courtiers' whispers shifted from fear of a magical cataclysm to smug satisfaction that the old hatreds had merely been papered over. Lord Elric and Lady Melody watched, their faces masks of grim approval. The poison was working, they thought. The heirs were learning their place. But in the stolen moments, in the hidden corners of the vast citadel, they were working. The library became their sanctuary. They no longer read the scrolls separately. They read them together. Their minds a fused conduit, interpreting the archaic texts not as histories of conflict, but as a single fractured narrative. They found fragments of a forgotten ritual, the tuning of the twin tides, a ceremony meant not to create a weapon, but to harmonize the two great houses with the land itself. It spoke of a place, a nexus, where the tear and the thorn were closest to the surface. The Serpent's Tear River, Aria said one night, tracing the course of the waterway on an old map. It carves the border between our lands. The Blackwood texts call it the Vein of Anger. The Silverbrook scrolls call it the River of Sorrows. Both names speak of a wound. What if it's not a wound? Kaelen mused, his finger tracing the same path, a breath away from hers. What if it's a scar? A place where the land healed but left a mark? A memory. The word, memory, caused the ink on the map to shimmer, and for a fleeting second, the river's blue line glowed with a soft, pulsing light. They were learning to focus their intent, to turn their shared understanding into a targeted, subtle magic. It was a quiet rebellion, fought not with armies, but with interpretation and intent. A week later, they found their opening. A springtide convocation was announced, a formal gathering of the vassal lords and ladies from both kingdoms to be held in the Great Hall. It was a political necessity, a public display of the new unity. For their parents, it was the perfect stage, a place to introduce the harmonious couple to the world, all while the Shadowfen clans sharpened their axes in the south. For Kaelen and Aria, it was a chance to change the story before it was written in blood. The day of the convocation, the great hall was transformed. The grim tapestries of conquest were covered by swaths of pale blue and silver luminara silk. The tables were laden with foods from both lands, Blackwood's hearty dark breads and roasted meats beside Silverbrook's delicate pastries and crystallized fruits. It was a fragile, forced pretense of peace. Aria and Kaelen entered together, the very picture of a dutiful, if distant, couple. They stood before the high table as the lords and ladies of two feuding kingdoms filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and fear. The air was a powder keg. A single misplaced word could ignite it. Lord Elric rose, a goblet in his hand. "Friends, allies," he boomed, the word allies tasting like a lie. "Today we witness a new dawn. The union of my son, Kaelen, and the esteemed Lady Aria is a bridge. A bridge built to span the chasm of our past. As he spoke the word bridge, a low, ominous creak echoed through the hall. The heavy stone beams overhead groaned, and a fine dust of mortar rained down onto the tables. The crowd flinched, a collective, nervous shudder. Aria felt the surge of pride from her father, the magic of dominance, of building, but building through force. She countered it instantly, focusing not on sorrow, but on connection. The thought of a living thing, a vine, not a structure. A tendril of green, impossibly vibrant, snaked its way down one of the main support pillars. It was a quiet act of defiance, a counter-narrative woven in living fiber. A few of the Luminara lords gasped in wonder. The Blackwood vassals looked on with deep suspicion. Lady Melody was on her feet, her smile as sharp as shattered glass. Indeed, a bridge. One must only hope the foundation is sound, for a bridge built on lies and ambition is nothing more than a convenient path to ruin. She let her gaze drift pointedly toward the covered tapestries. The word ruin was a spark to tinder. The chill of a tomb washed over the hall. The candles on the tables flickered, their light guttering, and the sweet scent of the food was overpowered by the damp, cold smell of a long-sealed crypt. This was it. The breaking point, the dissonance their parents had orchestrated. Kaelen met Aria's gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, unwavering resolve. They had rehearsed this, not with words, but with shared intent. He stepped forward, his movement drawing every eye. "The bridge of stone can be shattered," he said, his voice ringing with a new authority, an authority not of birth, but of resonance. "A bridge of silk can be torn." He held out his hand to her. She took it without hesitation. Their contact was the focal point, the still center of the coming storm. "Our parents speak of a bridge," Aria continued, her clear, musical voice cutting through the encroaching cold. "They see a structure to be built or broken, a tool of power, but they have misread the texts. They have misread the land. The convergence is not a bridge." As she spoke, the creeping vine on the pillar began to sprout tiny, bell-shaped flowers of a deep, luminous blue. The cold in the air lessened, held at bay. "It is a song," Kaelen finished, "a melody that requires two voices to be heard. The tear and the thorn, not in opposition, but in harmony." He raised their joined hands. The moment was charged, the very air seeming to thin and crackle around them. Then they let their combined magic flow. Not a chaotic burst, but a focused, controlled current. It was the memory of the snowflake, the vision of the shoot, the harmony of the fountain, given form and will. It began not as a spectacle, but as a feeling. A deep, thrumming peace that settled over the hall, soothing frayed nerves. The oppressive cold receded completely. The candles burned with a steady, warm light. Then, the true magic began. From the ceiling, motes of light, like captured starlight, began to drift down. They were not fire nor illusions. They were pure, gentle energy. As each mote touched one of the Blackwood nobles, they flinched, expecting pain or trickery. Instead, they felt a memory, not their own, but a shared one. The bitter taste of defeat at Argent, not as a history lesson, but as a personal, crushing loss. The hollow ache of a conquered home. The motes that drifted toward the Luminara guests brought a different sensation. Not pain, but a stark understanding. The brutal, unforgiving reality of the black rock and barren soil of the north. The desperate struggle to carve a life from a land that offered only stone. The grim necessity that had forged their enemy's iron will. They were not erasing the past. They were forcing everyone in the room to live in each other's skin. To feel the other side of the story. From their joined hands a single ribbon of light, one half shimmering blue, the other deep earthy brown, snaked out across the floor. It did not attack. It wove. It flowed between the tables, around the pillars, a living tapestry of interwoven light. Where it passed, it did not erase the Blackwood stone or the Luminara silk, but it bound them together, making them part of a single greater pattern. They call our power a curse. Aria's voice echoed in the stunned silence of the hall. A weapon, but a weapon is only a tool. It is the heart that wields it that decides its purpose. Our hearts choose not to build walls, but to mend the world they broke. And those who would use this power to reignite the old flames, Kaelen added, his gaze hardening as it fell upon Varric, who stood frozen near the shadows of the hall, will find themselves standing not on a battlefield, but in the ashes of their own ambition. At that, the ribbon of light surged. It did not strike Varric, but it illuminated the space around him, revealing what he had been hiding. A complex, shimmering ward, woven not of cloth or magic they recognized, but of something darker. A blood ward, ancient, forbidden magic, designed not to attack, but to reflect and amplify negative emotion. He had been a lens focusing every ounce of suspicion, every flicker of hatred in the room, magnifying it, aiming it at the high table. The discord hadn't been organic, it had been orchestrated. A collective gasp, this time of true horror, swept through the hall. The Blackwood lords looked at Varric, the lore master they had trusted for decades, with dawning revulsion. Lord Elric's face was a mottled purple. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared. That there was a tremor of fear in his voice. Varric, however, did not look afraid. He looked vindicated. He smiled, a slow, awful stretching of bloodless lips. "The meaning of this," he rasped, his voice carrying a horrifying certainty. "The meaning is truth. You have grown soft, my lord, content to play at peace with these weeping poets. I have spent 50 years ensuring the Blackwood heart did not forget its purpose. This," he gestured to the shimmering ward, "is the soul of our house, the will to dominate, the ambition to rule." His words were a lit match to the gasoline of fear. The few remaining tendrils of trust between the two kingdoms ignited into pure panic. A Blackwood general, his face a mask of fury at the loremaster's betrayal, drew his sword, its ring of steel a death knell in the hall. A Luminara diplomat, seeing the sword, cried out a warning. The sudden, sharp spike of fresh terror was all Varric needed. His ward drank it in, blowing with a malevolent, crimson light. He wasn't trying to control the power from the high table anymore. He was trying to make it implode, to prove it was a weapon, a force of destruction that could not be tamed. The floor of the great hall heaved. A great jagged crack shot from the base of the high table, bisecting the ribbon of light. The very foundation of the citadel was groaning in protest. Dust and chips rained down from the ceiling. This was the ruin Lady Melody had spoken of, not as a prophecy, but as a goal. "We have to stop him," Aria gasped, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped Kaelen's hand. "The ward is feeding on the chaos," Kaelen shouted over the rising din of shouting nobles and splintering stone. "We can't fight it with force. We have to starve it." "How?" Aria cried, her eyes wide as a tapestry depicting a Blackwood victory tore free from the wall and plummeted to the floor. "Give them something else to feel," Kaelen yelled, the idea a desperate, reckless leap of faith. "Not the past, not the fear, give them the future." It was the most dangerous thing they could do. To create a vision, not for two, but for hundreds of terrified minds, all while the world was literally collapsing around them. But it was the only way. They closed their eyes, shutting out the chaos, blocking out Varric's hate. They reached for each other, not just with their hands, but with their entire beings, their consciousnesses merging into a single focused point of will. They ignored the violent tremors of the earth, the screams of the courtiers. They reached for the one true thing they had discovered together, the green shoot in the cracked stone. They poured everything into that image. Not just a memory, but a promise. The seed of it burst from them, not as a fragile seedling, but as a wave of pure, unadulterated potential. It washed over the hall, and reality bent. The stone did not cease shaking, but the sound of its grinding agony was replaced by the soft, rhythmic thrum of a heartbeat. The splintering ceiling faded from view, replaced by a vast, star-dusted sky, impossibly deep and clear. The air, thick with dust and fear, became clean, fragrant with the scent of rain-washed earth and a new growth. Every person in the hall was no longer in a collapsing citadel. They were standing in the field from their shared vision. The ground beneath their feet was no longer polished flagstone, but dark, rich loam, cracked and dry, but full of promise. Before them, at the center of it all, stood Aria and Kaelen, no longer in their formal finery, but as simple, powerful figures. He held a stone, dark and solid. She held a vessel of water, clear and pure, and where the shadows they cast on the earth met, life erupted. It started as a single, vibrant green shoot. Then another, and another. A carpet of emerald grass spread across the barren field, pushing up through the cracks in the dry earth. Vines, thick and strong with life, wove themselves around the imagined pillars of the hall, not breaking them, but strengthening them, covering them in blossoms of silver and gold. The jagged crack in the floor became a river, not of chaos, but of clear, flowing water that nourished the newly sprung meadow. The vision was a masterpiece of shared creation. The Blackwood lords felt the strength of the earth beneath their feet, a solid, unshakable foundation that promised not conquest, but endurance. The Luminara courtiers felt the life-giving flow of the river, a promise of renewal, not surrender. They weren't being shown a future where one house ruled the other. They were being shown a future where the land itself was healed, and they, its children, were healed with it. The vision was so potent, so utterly real, that it starved Varric's ward of its fuel. Fear, hatred, panic. They all dissolved in the face of this overwhelming, shared wonder. The crimson ward flickered, its light sputtering like a dying candle, unable to find a single dark emotion to feed upon. "No!" Varric shrieked, a lone discordant note in a symphony of creation. "This is a lie, a trick. Look at your world, ye fools, it crumbles." But the people could not. They were lost in the beauty of the promise. They felt the grass under their boots, saw the impossible light of 1,000 new stars. They were no longer Blackwoods or Silverbrooks. They were witnesses. With a final, desperate cry, Varric made a fatal mistake. He threw all of his own malice, his own centuries-hoarded venom, into the ward. He poured himself into the spell to shatter the illusion, and the unified magic of Aria and Kaelen, now amplified by the hope of hundreds, turned it against him. His own darkness was reflected back at him, not as a weapon, but as truth. The rags of his lore master's robes fell away, revealing not a man, but a creature woven from shadow and spite, withered and ancient. The faces of all the souls he had sacrificed, the secrets he had twisted, the betrayals he had engineered over the centuries, flashed in the air around him, and damning spectral choir. He had not been preserving the Blackwood soul, he had been consuming it. The shock of the unfiltered feedback shattered him. He didn't scream, he imploded, collapsing in on himself with a soft, wet sound, leaving behind only a swirl of greasy smoke and the fading crimson echo of his ambition. As Varric vanished, the anchor of the grand vision broke. The star-dusted sky dissolved, the field of new life receded, and the great hall of the obsidian spire slammed back into reality. But it was not the hall they had left. The tremors had ceased. The jagged crack in the floor remained, but the river they had imagined now flowed within it, a clear, gentle stream that sparkled in the torchlight, its sound a soft murmur in the stunned silence. The vines on the pillars were gone, but carved into the stone itself were an intricate, interwoven patterns of leaf and root, permanent and beautiful. The air was clean, the scent of decay replaced by the clean, mineral smell of the water from the crack. The hall was still damaged, but it was no longer dying. It was changed, scarred, but also beautified. At the high table, Aria and Kaelen swayed, the effort of the shared vision leaving them ashen and exhausted. They clung to each other, the only solid thing in a world that had just been remade. Lord Elric stared at the stream flowing through the center of his great hall, at the life-given carvings on his stone pillars. His face was a mask of utter incomprehension, the iron certainty of a lifetime shattered into a million pieces. He looked at his son, not with anger, but with the dawning, terrifying awe a man might feel for a force of nature. He saw not a weapon he had forged, but a power he had never conceived of. He saw for the first time not a Blackwood heir, but the other half of a soul. Lady Melody stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Varric had been. She had gambled her daughter's life on a cynical truth, only to watch a profounder one unfold. She saw not a conquered girl, but a queen who had reshaped reality with her will. A single, perfect tear, not of sorrow, but of pure, unadulterated shock, traced a path down her cold cheek. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, one of the Luminara vassals, a grizzled old veteran who had lost 2 sons to the Blackwood wars, slowly knelt. He did not kneel to a Blackwood lord or a Silverbrook lady. He knelt and touched the surface of the new stream, as if tasting a miracle. One by one, others followed. First a Silverbrook lady, then a Blackwood general, their movements slow, reverent. They knelt by the water, or ran their hands over the newly carved vines. They were not submitting to a ruler. They were paying homage to a peace they could feel in their bones, a change they could see with their own eyes. The pact was sealed not in ink, but in water and stone. In the days that followed, the obsidian spire became a place of pilgrimage. The stream in the Great Hall was named the Nexus River, and its water was said to carry a faint trace of peace. Scholars from both houses flocked to the library, not to find precedents for war, but to decipher the newly unearthed texts on the tuning of the twin tides. Lord Elric did not speak to Kaelen for a week. When he finally did, it was not with an apology, but with a gruff, awkward demand. "Show me," he said, standing before the new carvings. "Show me how the stone remembers." It was the closest the proud lord could come to asking for a lesson. Aria found her mother in the sunken gardens. The rot had receded, and in its place, a new species of luminous blue-edged fungus grew, casting a gentle, ethereal light. Lady Melody was studying one. "They are beautiful," she said without turning, "and entirely useless. They serve no strategic purpose." She paused. "And yet, I cannot imagine the garden without them." A month later, they stood at the Serpent's Tier, on the newly built Bridge of Harmony, a structure of white stone and dark wood that elegantly spanned the chasm. The ceremony was small, private. There were no lords, no vassals, only their parents, standing at a distance, watching as their children repeated the ancient words of the tuning of the twin tides. They held no crowns. They held no swords. They simply held each other's hands, their gazes fixed on the churning water below. As they spoke the final words, there was no cataclysmic surge of power. There was no spectacle. Instead, for every person standing on the bridge, the wind carried a faint sound, a song. It was wordless, but it spoke of deep roots and flowing water, of strength and resilience, of grief turned to wisdom, and of a love that did not conquer, but connected. The world did not change overnight. Generations of mistrust could not be erased with a single vision. But the foundation had been laid, the sickness had been named, and the cure had begun to take root. Aria turned to him, a true, unburdened smile gracing her lips. "So," she said, her blue eyes reflecting the light of a new dawn, "what now, my lord?" Kaelen looked from her face to the lands before them, a tapestry of dark rock and green valleys, no longer a border but a shared home. He squeezed her hand, feeling the steady, comforting hum of their combined magic. not a weapon to be wielded, but a song to be sung together for the rest of their days. Now, he said, and for the first time the future felt not like a prophecy to be feared, but like an open page. We write our own chapter. And that was Harmony of Storm and Bloom. Thank you so much for listening, for letting this story live in your heart for a little while. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. It really helps more people find these worlds. There's so much more coming, more magic, more romance, more stories waiting to be told. So stay tuned. I'll be right here when you're ready for the next one.